Hey guys, welcome to another painting video. Today I will show you 7 ways you can use an airbrush for painting your miniatures.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURE. I will start from the super easy stuff that you can do as soon as you pick up any cheap airbrush and finish with some of the more advanced techniques that need quite a bit of practice and can benefit from having a fancier, more expensive model.
So without any further ado, let's jump into the first one, which is simply priming your miniatures.
You might be surprised to learn that despite having put together hundreds and hundreds of models, I have never in my life used a spray can to prime them. When I started out in the hobby and bought my first box of minis, I bought a can of spray primer as well, and I still have it for some reason, but I have never used it. At this point it would be probably safer to dispose of it, to be honest. Instead, I started by using a brush-on primer first, but only in a couple of weeks I was already so hooked into the hobby that I bought myself a cheap airbrush kit and I started using it to prime my minis.
And I guess now you're asking yourself why this is better than using a spray can when all the other YouTubers always show doing it that way, and everyone else seems to prefer that method as well.
And honestly, I ask myself the same question all the time as well, just the other way around. Why would you use a spray can, especially when you already have an airbrush? With an airbrush you can prime your models indoors. The weather and humidity doesn't affect your ability to prime at all, and your chances of ruining your mini with an airbrush are basically zero. Seriously, I have seen so many posts from some really sad beginners who ruined their models just because the temperature or the humidity wasn't right, or because they didn't hold the can at the right distance, or they didn't shake it long enough, they didn't spray in bursts, or maybe because the stars didn't align the right way. None of that is an issue with an airbrush. You simply take some airbrush primer, for example I like the ones from Vevor, you add a little airbrush thinner, something like 20%, and the rest you fill with the primer right from the bottle. You mix it a little with an old brush and by blowing back some air by holding the nozzle closed with your finger, and that's it, you are all set, now you just have to spray away. Another advantage of this method is that you can be way more accurate than with the can. I saw friends models after he primed them and they still had some spots in the deepest crevices which were not covered by the primer. With the airbrush you will leave no crevice untouched. I have been using this method for years on hundreds of minis and never had any issues with it. It's hard for me to even imagine having to put up with all the drawbacks of using a can primer. Also, I have dedicated my old cheap airbrush for this. I have fancier ones for the more complicated tasks, but for priming the old workhorse is perfect.
The second technique is something I use almost as much as priming, and you can once again do it with almost any cheap airbrush with minimal practice. I'm talking about zenithal highlighting. In fact, I use this technique so much that I have a dedicated video about how to do it, so I suggest checking that out for all the details.
But in a sense, zenithal priming is when you spray a lighter color, most commonly white, over a darker primer at a zenithal angle, meaning from above at around 45 degrees or so. And this can serve a lot of different purposes. First of all, it creates a much lighter undercoat, so when you cover the surface with paint over this, it will be more vibrant and colorful than over pure black. It is also better than a simple white primer because it leaves the areas that are deeper and further down on the model darker. Since those should be naturally darker due to how the light and shadows behave, this creates a much more natural looking model without much effort. It also creates some organic transitions on the larger surfaces when you cover them with paint, especially when you use something that is even more transparent than normal acrylics, like inks for example. And believe it or not, I have a video about using inks as well, so if you want to learn more about how you can paint super vibrant minis with their help, give that a watch as well. Fortunately for us, zenithal priming is just as easy to do as priming, so you don't need any fancy airbrush or too much experience to do it. I have 2 bottles of Vallejo white airbrush paint set aside specifically for this task. And since these are formulated for airbrushing, you can use them right out of the pot without dilution, but I usually add a little bit of airbrush thinner to make things smoother and then I just blast away from above.
The third use case for an airbrush can be extremely useful, especially when you need to paint a large surface or when you paint a lot of models in the same color. Base coating or undercoating your models can take up a lot of time, but even using a cheap airbrush you can do it in a fraction of that time and better than with a brush.
Achieving a smooth base coat on something with a brush is trickier than one might think, and if you have to do it on dozens of models because you are painting a whole army, it can be a pain. But with an airbrush you can simply prime and zenithal highlight the models and then spray on the primary color in only a couple of minutes per figure. You can be as selective with where you apply the color as with the regular brush, and you have to fix some of the overspray before moving on to the next step, but let's be honest, we would make mistakes with a brush as well, especially when we are painting the 25th Space Marine in the army. With absolutely minimal airbrushing experience, you can paint a smooth base coat on your figures in minutes, and that is something that is hard to argue with as a batch painter. But the same method can also be used for more artistic techniques as well. For example, instead of a base coat, you can spray on a colorful undercoat on your mini that you use to modify the shadow colors on your figure, like I did on this Tau battlesuit. The airbrush allows you to put any color on your model quickly and effectively. The only question is which color to use, and this is where this video's sponsor Skillshare comes in. Skillshare is the largest online learning community with thousands of classes led by experts across art, illustration, design, productivity and more. Skillshare can help you take your hobbies and skills, or even side hustles in my case, to the next level. If you're searching for resources to learn about volumes and shapes, or even everyone's favorite topic, color theory, then you can find a ton of material to learn from on Skillshare, so you can use it on your miniature projects later on. But we are not limited to just art and miniature related courses either. For example, I found a great course about video creation and script writing by MKBHD, one of my favorite tech YouTubers that I am in the process of watching. And I already saved some courses about photography and video editing in my classes as well, so I can improve my miniature photography and to pick up some editing tips so I can make even better videos for you guys.
If that sounds interesting to you, the first 500 people to use the link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. It's literally a whole month of free learning, so why not give it a try? Thanks for Skillshare for sponsoring this video. For the fourth thing you can do with the airbrush, let's mention one last simple technique before moving on to the more complex stuff. Let's talk about varnishing.
Varnishing is basically a method to protect your paint job from the outside world by spraying a varnish layer over the paint that is much more resistant to outside forces than just the paint would be. Most people would only do this once they are done with the model with the intention of protecting it from them handling it while playing with them, but I also use it quite a bit during the painting process, especially when I'm highlighting or glazing with the airbrush, which we are going to talk about in a minute. Similarly to primers, most people would use a can to apply the varnish, or alternatively they would brush it on manually. Doing it by hand is not exactly easy over larger surfaces without messing them up, and the can comes with the same drawbacks as a primer. But with an airbrush you can simply mix a couple of drops of airbrush thinner with a little more varnish and spray it on in seconds or minutes. You just repeat this a couple of times, waiting for the previous layer to dry, and there you go, now your models and paint layers are protected with very little effort and time invested.
Alright, now with the simple stuff out of the way, it's time to talk about something that requires a little more skill and experience and can also benefit from a better airbrush. The fifth technique you can do with an airbrush is highlighting your models.
As miniature painters, we spend a lot of time adding highlights on our models, simulating how the light would interact with a figure if it was 1:1 scale. We usually do this by laboriously applying the highlights with the brush layer by layer. With the airbrush you can do the same thing, creating much smoother and prettier transitions and way faster too. Now the airbrush is still a tool and it is not a magic wand that can do everything, so it has its limitations as well. For example, you won't be able to do edge highlights with this, it will cover over the whole surface including all the deeper parts as well, so you have to fix that later on, and if you don't use masks, it can cause overspray as well. But if you're mindful of these things, you can achieve perfect transitions and volumetric highlights with it in minutes. You will still need to work on the model with a brush, there is no way around that, but the fact that you can prime, zenithal highlight, base coat and highlight a whole troop in less than an hour is pretty crazy and it's hard to argue with. It needs to be mentioned though that for this to work, especially on smaller figures, you need some experience with the airbrush. You need to be able to control where you are hitting, with how much paint and pressure, and you need to dial in the paint dilution as well if you don't want to ruin your whole paint job. And the smaller the highlights, the more difficult this can be. You can still do this with a cheaper airbrush, but they are not really meant for this kind of stuff. You will be fighting against your own tools. It can be done, but it's much easier to do this with a more professional airbrush model. For example, I use a Harder and Steenbeck Evolution for these kind of tasks, and it has worked great for me so far.
For the sixth technique, I need to mention shading, which is basically the evil twin of highlighting. Similarly to how you can apply highlights with the airbrush, you can also use it to apply your shadows.
This works much the same way as highlighting does, but instead of applying lighter and lighter colors on the surfaces pointing towards the light, we add darker and darker colors on the surfaces facing down. The goal is the same, adding more contrast on the model, so creating a bigger difference between the highest highlights and the darkest shadows. But instead of meticulously glazing in the darker colors on the panels, we can simply use the airbrush to spray them on, basically from a reverse zenithal angle. And of course we are not restricted to use only blacks for this. Most of the time I use this method to add some nice contrasting shadow color, for example a blue or violet on a red model or a red shadow on a blue model. This requires less finesse than highlighting, so technically you could do it with a cheaper airbrush as well, but since I usually do it when the rest of the model is already painted, I prefer to use a better airbrush that I'm more confident in, so I don't accidentally splatter paint over the rest of the model.
Finally, let's talk about the most difficult thing you can use an airbrush for on your minis, glazing.
Glazing is usually done with a brush, and it is some of the most delicate work one can do on a figure, so you might think that an airbrush is not going to be precise enough to do something like that, but you would be mistaken. The airbrush has a couple of huge advantages over a brush when it comes to glazing, and a couple of big disadvantages as well that we have to overcome if we want to take advantage of it for this technique. First and foremost, the airbrush is great for depositing very smooth, thin and transparent layers over a surface, which is exactly what glazing is. The problem is that in order to achieve it on a small surface like a single element of a mini, you need a very good airbrush that can be controlled precisely enough so you don't actually flood the paint job you worked on for hours with paint. You also need to find the right dilution for that paint where it covers just enough but not too much, and you need to be able to actually control the airbrush with enough precision to achieve what you want, since no matter how good the tool is, if the user cannot use it properly. But if you can do all that, you will be able to smooth over tiny transitions on your models or to add cool new tones onto an already existing paint job to make it even cooler. It might seem very daunting to spray over the paint job you worked for hours to achieve, but with a little practice you can really elevate your results a lot. And with some experience under your belt, you won't even think about making a mistake, you will spend more time thinking about what else you could use it for. And the funny thing is that you don't actually need a super expensive airbrush for this. I have an Infinity CR Plus that I bought for detail work, but most of the time I end up using the Evolution for this sort of thing as well.
Alright, with that we have reached the end of this video. I hope I managed to get you interested in using an airbrush for painting your minis. If you want more information about the advantages and disadvantages of using one, there is a video about just that on the channel, give it a watch. Also, if you're interested in seeing more of these techniques, I have a lot more videos on YouTube and PDF painting guides, as well as more real-time footage on Patreon, so check those out as well. And before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for their support. They are the ones that make this channel possible, especially the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys, see you in the next one.